Hello and welcome to this video, Shelf Life for Foods. My name's Andy Bowles and I'm a food lawyer. Now this video is the 27th in a series of 100 on UK food law topics I'm recording. Now you may be watching this video as part of our online training service, in which case you've got access to additional resources that go along with this video. So you can download additional materials, click on links and that sort of thing. You also have access to an hour-long webinar on this topic, so it goes into a lot more detail. But if you're watching this on our YouTube channel, you are of course welcome. Now I'm talking about shelf life of foods, but what is a shelf life? Well, I need to distinguish two issues here: food safety and food quality. Now they can be intermingled if you like, but if you're producing a food right from the outset, you're thinking about what shelf life you need to put on that food. You should be considering, is shelf life a food safety issue or is it a food quality issue? Now, in terms of food quality, the shelf life that would apply to a food to retain its particular quality, if you like, is a minimum durability. For food safety purposes, the shelf life that you would apply to a food, in other words, the time from production to the time that it becomes potentially unsafe, or obviously this side of that time, is called the use-by date. So we have a shelf life, it's either the use-by or minimum durability date. So minimum durability date, or best before date, or best before end, means the date at which the food retains its specific properties when properly stored. It's a quality issue. You would put a best before date on a packet of biscuits or a packet of cornflakes or a tin of baked beans because you've got conditions there where you're not going to get the growth of dangerous food poisoning bacteria because of the qualities of the food. And I'm going to talk about those in a moment. So the shelf life, in other words, the date from production of the food to the date that you recommend the food is consumed, would be a best before date. After that date, the food is probably going to be all right, but it might not be. It might deteriorate in quality. Your baked beans, the colour might fade a bit. Your biscuits might go a bit soggy. You know, your cornflakes or something might also go soggy or start getting broken up or whatever. So in other words, when looking at shelf life and you've considered a minimum durability is appropriate, you're thinking about the quality of the food. On the other hand, a use-by date is used on perishable foods, highly perishable foods. In other words, highly perishable foods that on expiry of a use-by date are likely to constitute a danger to human health. Why is that the case? Well, because these are perishable. You produce your food on day one, you apply a shelf life having conducted appropriate studies on the food. By using your system based on HACCP principles, you will have identified, associated with your food, likely food poisoning bacteria, which ones are likely to be present, which ones are potentially likely to grow, and then you would put in place controls to make sure that that doesn't happen. One of those controls would be the use-by date. So you might set a use-by date so that up until that date, the food poisoning bacteria are guaranteed to be under control. After that date, those guarantees are not there. So therefore the food could constitute a danger to health. Now, of course, the issue with use-by date is that consumers should never consume a food that has expired a use-by date. Food businesses should never use ingredients that have expired use-by dates, and should never definitely put foods on sale that have expired use-by dates. Even freezing or preserving foods that have expired use-by dates for a further future use would also be an unsafe practice. On the other hand, if a food has expired its best before date, well, yes, it could still be placed on the market as long as the quality is good enough. So hopefully this point, it's a really important and crucial point really, but there is a distinction to be made between quality of food, safety of food, minimum durability, quality, use-by date, safety. So what factors affect shelf life? Well, obviously the physical structure and form of the food. So for example, you might have a frozen food, you might have a dried food, you might have a powdered food. These will affect the shelf life, wouldn't they? I mean, I've already mentioned something like biscuits being a sort of a sugary but very sort of solid food. That will affect and prevent some bacteria from growing. The chemical composition of food is really important. Water activity, in its simplest term, water activity is really the water available to microbes to allow them to grow. You can put a bacteria into a liquid, but if the water in that liquid is not available to the bacteria won't grow. What I mean is, for example, if you've got salt water or sugary water, you put bacteria in there, something like Salmonella, it won't be able to grow because it won't be able to absorb the water. The osmotic pressure, the pressure from salt solutions or sugar solutions will be too much for it to extract water for its own growth. So water activity isn't just about the sogginess of food, the moistness of food. Some moist foods could have very low water activities, water available to microbes, because it's locked in elsewhere. The bacteria can't get at it. But also, dry foods would also have a very low water activity. Your biscuits would have low water activity. A piece of Parmesan cheese would have very low water activity because they're like sort of concrete, aren't they? Acidity, pH. We're talking about the more acidic a food is, the less likely that most food poisoning bacteria can grow. So things like pickled foods, for example, you don't get Salmonella growing in vinegar. Again, it's just too acidic for the bacteria to thrive in those conditions. Redox potential is the reduction and oxidation of foods. You can have oxidation typically of saturated fats, for example. Something like butter, if you just leave it out at room temperature and exposed to the elements, butter will go rancid quite quickly. And that's because of oxidation of the saturated fats. So the quality of foods can really be affected by factors such as redox potential of the food. But microbial growth is obviously a key factor, both in terms of spoilage, but also in terms of safety. So what factors affect microbial growth? Well, the main ones would be time. The more time you give bacteria to grow, the more likely they are going to grow. I mean, assuming the environment is suitable for them. Some bacteria cause food poisoning not through just being present, but by producing toxins or poisons. For example, Clostridium botulinum is a food poisoning bacteria that is present maybe in refrigerated foods. It can grow at low temperatures. But the thing about Clostridium botulinum is it can grow in the absence of air. So it's particularly of concern in things like vacuum-packed foods. So if you have a vacuum-packed food being held and it has Clostridium botulinum in it, it's not the bacteria that causes the problem. It's the toxin produced by the bacteria. And the bacteria needs time to produce that toxin. So a shelf life of a food where Clostridium botulinum is likely to be present and is capable of growing can be assured as being safe if you actually reduce the time of the shelf life. You basically reduce it down to a time that the bacteria cannot produce toxin and cannot be a problem. Temperature, I've already mentioned temperature. Most food poisoning bacteria will grow at sort of body temperature, and that's why they're pathogenic to us. But many bacteria can grow at extremes, if you like. So, for example, Listeria monocytogenes is of concern in the food industry because it grows at refrigerated temperatures. So, Listeria will obviously be of a bit of a worry. It normally needs the next one on, oxygen, to grow Listeria in foods, but is capable of growing in the absence of oxygen. I mentioned Clostridium botulinum in vacuum-packed foods. It can grow in the absence of oxygen. But in terms of temperature, while it will grow slowly at refrigerated temperatures, Clostridium botulinum will not grow at temperatures of 3 degrees centigrade or below. So you can see how using these factors here already, if we have a shelf life that is only of a few days in duration, if we have a temperature that is 3 degrees or below, if we actually have an atmosphere that includes oxygen, we're putting in loads of factors here that are targeted at those two bacteria, for example, Clostridium botulinum and Listeria. Typically, Listeria isn't a problem if the shelf life is 5 days or less. Osmotic pressure I've mentioned, sugar solutions, salt solutions, bacteria need good neutral conditions in order to be able to thrive and exchange fluids, water with the environment. pH, acidity I've talked about, and just the presence of nutrients. At the end of the day, bacteria, molds will only grow if they've got the food to grow on. So how do bacteria grow? Well, there is this sort of classic chart you can see behind me here. If you place some bacteria into a food, for example, so you've just contaminated your cooked meat with some salmonella, what will happen is initially the bacteria will experience a lag phase. They won't suddenly grow automatically. It will take them a little time to grow, that lag phase. Once they've established themselves, once they've acclimatized to their environment, they'll go through what's known as the exponential growth. You see that big, huge growth where it goes up the hill until they get to a point where actually the population is saturated. There's not enough food, or the conditions are not suitable for a larger population to be sustained, in which case they get into the stationary phase and then they start dying out. Shelf life determination is all about, as far as possible, extending the lag phase, making the environment in which bacteria or molds can be introduced sort of hostile environment for microbes. So if you have a hostile environment for microbes in your food, should they be present, they won't be able to grow. So that lag phase gets drawn out. If you can draw out that lag phase, that's your shelf life. You're keeping your bacteria of concern that you've identified through your HACCP study in a process called stasis. They're not growing. Obviously, the concern here is if you have a use by date equal to the lag phase, straight after your lag phase, it's exponential growth. You can see the hazards associated with highly perishable foods that have expired their use by dates. So an example would be Listeria monocytogenes. Now, there's lots of writing on the screen. You probably can't read it behind me, but I'll just run through it. Products with a pH less or equal to 4.4 pH, that's pretty acidic, or water activity of 0.92, which is actually pretty dry, will not support the growth of Listeria. A pH of 5 and a water activity of 0.94. Now, you notice that these are not absolute values. You've got either a pH of 4.4 and 0.92 water activity, or pH 5 and 0.94. And you'll find that that is a very common issue in shelf life determination, that actually each of these factors is referred to as a hurdle. So pH is one hurdle. If you think of a sort of hurdle race, a steeplechase, whatever. If you've got one hurdle is pH, another hurdle is water activity, another hurdle is sort of the redox potential, then a shelf life can actually be developed by having a whole series of hurdles that the bacteria have to overcome in order to grow. In other words, it becomes more difficult. It's a hostile environment for them to grow, and your lag phase gets drawn out and out and out. Listeria monocytogenes is basically seen to be, or in law, is defined as, I suppose, acceptable. A food is not capable of supporting the growth of Listeria if the shelf life is 5 days or less. So products that have those characteristics in law will not support the growth of Listeria monocytogenes. So as part of your HACCP, if Listeria is identified as a concern, it's maybe you've got chilled cooked meats, chilled fish, maybe you've got ready meals, something like that. You've identified Listeria as a real concern. Then if you can hit those targets in your processing, if your food can meet those characteristics, then Listeria won't be a problem. Or if you have a shelf life of 5 days or less, Listeria won't be a problem. Assuming, you properly cook your foods and all the rest of it. So it's, as I've said, important to determine shelf life in accordance with safety and spoilage. Now, you might have your eye on both. You might have your eye on only one of them because the products are inherently safe. They just need to prevent spoilage. Like I use the example of biscuits. So the actual process of shelf life determination is a multi-stage one. I mentioned HACCP. HACCP is obviously a risk assessment, the hazard analysis critical control point system. If you're not familiar, there is a short video on that. You come out with a theoretic shelf life. What you would do in your HACCP, through your hazard analysis, you would identify the potential concerns, microbes of concern with your food, and then you will make sure that you put in appropriate controls. You might well carry studies out on your food just to see what the pH is, what the water activity is, because there might be inherent controls in your food. But your HACCP study is your first step, but it's quite theoretical in nature. Then you need to validate your HACCP. So as validation, you'll be doing some products, sort of, product trials. So having got your theoretical HACCP, you might run your product. You've assumed it's going to have a water activity or so forth, or pH of this. So you run your product trials and actually make sure that's the case. But then you do your actual shelf life determination. This is sort of verification. Having validated that the process should work, you run the process to make sure that it is working in practice, that your criteria that you'll set, the critical control points, if that's what they are, of, for example, pH, water activity, are not theoretically achievable, they are achieved on every occasion. And then you would do ongoing shelf life studies, because typically in manufacturing, for example, you might retain products, do some end of shelf life checks, that sort of thing. The theory might be great, it might be working in practice in the factory, but you want to make sure that the foods are behaving in the way that you would expect. And remember, if you go back to the relevant law on this, which is the microbiological criteria of foodstuffs regs, there is a separate video on that, you need to be considering the reasonably foreseeable conditions under shelf life. So it's not just about making sure that bacteria don't grow in your factory, you need to make sure they don't grow throughout the shelf life. When you're actually setting your shelf life, there are a number of factors that will influence this. Commercial requirements is often a big one. If you're a small business and you need your product to have a 12-day shelf life, because otherwise it's not viable. In other words, you need to produce your food, store your food, distribute your food, send it to your customers who need to store it and then sell it. If you've worked out 12 days is the only commercial viable shelf life, then you need to make sure it's safe. If it's not safe, then you don't do it. It is as simple as that. What you don't do is just determine shelf life by just adding on a few extra days here and there just to make sure you can sell a product. Make sure your product is going to be safe. You need to be thinking about what sort of things are likely to affect deterioration. Is there a long supply chain? Are you supplying a product to retailers who might, or wholesalers who might be supplying retailers? What is the likelihood of things like temperature abuse? It reasonably foreseeable. When your delivery driver turns up, are they likely to leave the foods in crates outside the premises before it opens? In other words, are they going to be exposed to breaches in the temperature control chain? You need to think about these, because if you can design in controls, then that makes life a lot easier. Because what you don't want to do is have a shelf life determination of a food that's going to be in the perfect world and then send it out into the very less than perfect world. Description of the food, you need to understand your numbers, you need to understand your pH, your water activity, your salt content. That is a requirement in law, but certainly products that are liable to sustain the outgrowth of listeria, you are required to carry out studies in law. So some initial analysis of food is often very helpful. Product trials, of course, goes without saying, but you can use predictive modelling. There are lots of microbiological tools out there, like Combase, for example, that can help you. But typically they need some expert input. You put in all the parameters, you put in all the physical and chemical characteristics of your food, you put in the details of particular bacteria, and you can, through predictive modeling, predict how your food is going to react, how bacteria are going to grow or not in your foods. But this is all theoretic. It's not a complete substitute to proper product trials. There are some special cases. There are some foods where there's guidance out there. For example, vacuum packed chilled foods. There's guidance from the Food Standards Agency recommending, a maximum shelf life of 10 days for foods that are kept at 8 degrees or less. So there are occasions where you just need to go with properly published guidance and run with that. Okay, well, look, there's shelf life. If that's just one of 100 videos that I'm recording on food law topics in the UK, so hopefully you'll join me on the next one. Thank you for watching.